Well, we are live with Jane Kamensky, who is the Jonathan Trumbull Professor of American History at Harvard and the Forsheimer Foundation, the Carl and Lily Forsheimer Foundation Director of the Schlesinger Library on the history of women at the Radcliffe Institute. So thank you for joining us, Jane. I was meaning to give an introduction to the podcast. This is the Revolution 250 podcast. I am Bob Allison from Suffolk University and chair of the Rev 250 Advisory Committee, and Rev 250 is committed. It's a consortium of about 60 organizations in and around Massachusetts, committed to commemorating the story of the founding 250 years ago. And so we're delighted to have Jane Kamensky with us, the Jonathan Trumbull Professor of American History, Forsheimer Foundation, Director of the Schlesinger Library. So thank you for joining us, Jane.
Thanks for asking me, Bob. Happy to be here.
It's great to have you. I know you've been, Jane, I will tell the folks a little bit more about you. You are someone who really needs no introduction. I've always found that not to be true about anyone. You studied at Yale, got your PhD at Yale, and then taught at Brandeis for about 20 years, and then taught at Brown, and now are at Harvard. And have written a number of books. Your most recent one is on John Singleton Copley, the portrait artist, Revolution in Color. And Copley is a fascinating guy in this whole period.
I could not agree more. I loved spending a season of my researching and writing life trying to see the revolutionary world through his eyes, and trying to sort of unpack the ironies about who he was and the fact that so much of our ability to picture the world of the 1760s and 1770s in our mind's eye comes from his brush. Perhaps most famously, the picture of Paul Revere looking soulfully into his teapot. So it was a great opportunity to work on an artist's life whose work gave us so much of the way that we see the American Revolution.
Right, we really know what they look like because Copley painted them, and yet he wasn't always on their side.
Well, I mean, I think one of the fascinating things about his biography and about his world is the way that the sides shifted in time, right? So that the joke that I've had students make, either knowingly or unknowingly, going to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston and seeing the portrait of John Hancock as a merchant before his ledger isn't it amazing that he's practicing his signature for the Declaration of Independence 11 years down the road? And of course, time doesn't work that way. So that when Copley paints his big 3/4 length portraits of the Patriot super friends as we see them in the Museum of Fine Arts, right? The John Hancock, the Sam Adams, the Mercy Otis Warrens, the Joseph Warren. He's painting a group of elite Bostonians who want to make themselves by having an image in a sort of popular contemporary art style on their walls. And he's not painting parties. People are only beginning to imagine themselves as ideologues in an unfolding struggle. Their own positions are shifting. He, as you intimate, is a person who almost Bartleby-like would just generally prefer not to when it comes to revolutionary upheaval. I think that's partly characterological for him, and it's partly professional, right? Somebody who is in a fine bespoke trade and needs patrons with image making needs and disposable income in order to carry off his work successfully, can't afford to alienate significant factions of either his viewing public or his patron public. So a painter has to sort of to say a painter threads a needle is a mixed metaphor, but a painter has to mix his colors carefully in seeking patronage. So I think, one of the things that is revealing and important about him as a revolutionary actor is his reservations and his ambivalence. Ultimately, what I might call his political modesty, right? There is a kind of humility before unfolding events, a tentativeness, a fear, a willingness to hang back and learn more, which I think is a posture of a lot of, in fact, of the predominance of people in the era of the American Revolution, and one we might still learn from. So I love his ambivalence, both as a sort of vexed individual and as a person who occupied an echelon in society.
He is a tradesman. That is, he's doing this for a living rather than to make a statement. So it's very much like Franklin's apology for printers. That is, print. He's painting the people who can pay him to paint them. And it does make some paintings as statements. We think about his historical paintings, that he does more when he gets to London. So I'm wondering now, one of the things you do in your book and in your other work is really complicate an understanding of something we think we know. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about teaching the revolution, which is a subject we think we know about, and you really are challenging your students to look at it differently. And how do you go about doing that?
So I think one of the big challenges in teaching the revolution right now is that we have so much excellent recent scholarly work on the challenges and the what we might even call the trauma of the American Revolution. So the revolution as a civil war that pitted many factions of British American and Indigenous American society against each other as a war of empires. The revolution as a war that was shot through with concern about slavery and concern by enslaved people about where they might best find their liberty. And of course, with the predominant answer being remaining in empire. A revolution with significant class cleavages, separating many of the crowds in the streets from many of the pamphleteers and ideologues, a revolution of shocking violence, right? I think that's one of the things that we tend to erase from sort of rose-colored views of the American founding, is that it's a war, and it's a protracted and extremely deadly war. That's, those have been the directions of scholarship since round about 1968. At the same time, it is a particular privilege and responsibility to teach the founding of the United States in the United States to young people who must perforce go on and take the reins of power in the United States as citizens and inhabitants in a demanding form of government, and a demanding form of government bequeathed to us by the American Revolution. So I'm interested in telling true histories of the American Revolution that can still inspire civic action, civic purpose, and indeed pride. Where is I wrote a piece for Reviews in American History 2 years ago after the lecture course I give in the American Revolution at Harvard first debuted, where I tell the story of a student who took the class because he was a reenactor in Concord. And I think the third generation of his family to play that role, and perhaps with some genealogical connection to the events in Concord and Lexington in 1775. And I did a little interview with each of them at the end of the class, a sort of metacognitive exercise. What did you learn? How will you act on it? And I said, what's your reenactment group doing over the summer? And he said, I quit. And I said, well, why? And he said, because what I learned in the class is it's all lies. And I thought it was a very arresting moment for me where obviously what I had done in the classroom was insufficient if it didn't lead him back into his commemorative work with something rich but still hopeful that he could do in that public history space. So at a moment, today in 2021, a day before an inauguration, which has been surrounded by tremendous upheaval and even violence, and with these two big public history statements on the table from the 1619 Project on the one hand, and the president's released this morning 1776 Commission report on the other, I'm very interested as a scholar and as a teacher and as a citizen in how we tell true stories of the American Revolution that are giving young people the keys, as well as reasons like Copley to be reflective in their patriotism, subtle in their patriotism, demanding and even critical in their patriotism in the name of 1776.
So how do you think we do that?
The way that I've been trying to do it in recent iterations of this course is by doing capstone projects that are engaged with the work of public history in various different directions. When I last taught the course in the fall of 2019, students worked with the American Repertory Theater on what was then to be an upcoming production of 1776. They worked with the Longfellow House, interpreting some of George Washington's letters for online audiences. They worked with the old State House, now Revolutionary Spaces, on their Boston Massacre commemorative exhibitions. Thinking about how they would communicate scholarly work to the public in a way, I guess for me, and this is true in teaching in general, I think it's useful for students to think of an audience who is not you or me, right? Who is, an ultimate audience who is not you or me. And when the subject is the American Revolution, the ultimate audience is this vitally important political theory concept of we the people, right? If the audience is we the people, what do we the people need to know? Especially the ones who did museum work where they were talking to docents and imagining a public very directly. I think they had the sense that the visitors to a museum needed to reckon and wrestle, but they also needed to leave with a sense of being activated, not a sense of being devastated. Mm-hmm. The place where I think that was most fully realized in the students' work was the exhibition that the Peabody Essex Museum put on of the Harlem Renaissance painter Jacob Lawrence's really long unseen series called The Struggle, a series of paintings about the American Revolution. And they worked with the docents and the museum education department in devising the toolkit to educate from that museum. We went to see it as a class after the fact. And one of the things the museum had done was to structure a sort of response wall from visitors, where you could see the feedback on the very things that I wanted to train my class about. I left this. I never knew about the impact of the revolution on enslavement or the impact of enslaved peoples on the revolution. And seeing this exhibit makes me want to go out and, there was a sort of like great improv, right? You say yes and, not no, oh my God. Mm-hmm. It's a privilege to teach in a place like Harvard, obviously, where I have confidence that my students really are leaders of future discussions in many different ways, but also, just for its location in the greater Boston area, where there will always be public history projects of many different kinds we can connect to. Rev 250 is such a wonderful potential convener. And I think as the year 2026 approaches, we have opportunities to do really rich teaching in and beyond our classrooms about what a commemoration means. A commemoration is not a celebration. A commemoration can be a reckoning. It can be an education. It can be space for reflection. It's an agenda setting moment. I'm sure you and I are both tremendously in debt to the flowering of work on colonial America that came out in and around 1976.
Yes.
So I'm really interested in the kinds of partnerships that will allow us to seize that commemorative moment for broad public education.
Right. It's fascinating that we hope that there will always be this public history component here in Boston, but we know how tenuous a lot of these institutions are. And we do, you remind us of the real obligation we have to do this well and to engage the public without necessarily beating them over the head with their transgressions. There are places to do that. And so I'm really thinking about, you've also done some work with the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia, which is a tremendous place. Can you tell us a bit more about what's up there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I serve as a trustee to the Museum of the American Revolution. I think, which is both a young institution, only open to the public less than 5 years ago, but long in the making. And I think they are doing some of the best, sort of subtlest, most complex yet most inspiring education, history education that I've seen on any topic, any place. And it's an ideologically pluralist organization, private organization who, in its founding and execution has stakeholders that range from sort of conventionally patriotic, even military history points of view, to the Oneida Nation, to scholars of race, gender, indigeneity. So it's, I think it's having deliberative civic discussions about the portrayal of the revolution throughout the years that prefigure its opening. The gesture, I think, that most captures the work of that museum for me is that it ends with a wall of mirrors, so that instead of looking only at Copley portraits of a time long ago, student visitors, family visitors, and with the revolution, with themselves framed as the next generation of the American Revolution and its legacies of equality braided with liberty in all of our hands. It's very powerful to see students arrive at that moment where they become the portrait, and think about what they've seen in a hall that shows the Liberty Tree and Action Out of Doors, or what they've seen in the new installation about women voting, for examples that they will take forward in their own lives. So I think it's a place that's doing a really brilliant job of a form of deep, reflective, critically engaged patriotism. One
of my favorite Copley paintings is in the Boston Public Library, and this huge historical painting of Charles V entering Parliament to demand the arrest of 5 members. And to him, it is a dramatic scene in British history, in English history, and ultimately in American history, as we think about the revolution really being a time when we're creating this new government. I'm just wondering why Copley thought there would be a big audience for this in London when he painted it.
So, one of the things that I love about Copley as a biographical subject is he's a tragic hero, right? And one of his tragedies, his part of his heroism is his very American ambition. He's somebody who's born quite desperately poor, a child of the wharves, of Irish immigrants, who really yearns to be at the highest reaches of a trade which is itself aspirational, just in the way that printers are, as you were saying before, right? It's not a learned profession, but it's trafficking with those people. The highest echelon of art in Copley's day is historical painting. These many peopled paintings that he really has to be in London to be able to see and do. One of his tragedies is he emigrates too late, or he repatriates too late, right? He's a British American and repatriates to the metropolis in 1774. And he can't quite figure out, and maybe it would have been impossible to figure out in the 1770s and 1780s, how to really capitalize on his Americanness for a British audience, and to capitalize in the literal sense of capital, right? As you were saying, he needs to get paid for it, and with history paintings, really to find public patronage for it, because nobody's hanging Charles V over their couch. And what he tries to do, I think, more successfully in some pictures than in others, is to paint sort of vibrantly scenes that have a vibrant resonance with American politics, without being so direct or didactic that they offend anybody. The most successful of these, I think, is the absolutely glorious death of Major Pearson, showing the Battle of Jersey, the Battle of the Isle of Jersey, a revolutionary struggle that you would have needed to read the teeny tiniest type in London newspapers to care about at all. But he wrings a kind of imperial glory from that scene that is also very beautiful, and that I think doesn't cause an audience that's going to see it in a tent in Green Park or in the Royal Academy exhibition, to affix a rosette saying that they are either Tories or American sympathizers. I think that Charles V is trying even more distantly and allegorically to make a similar point about liberty. So I see it as one of the many paintings where he tries to be pro-British without being anti-American.
Right. It really reminds us that as today, that time was fraught with political tension. You mentioned earlier that we have the 1619 project, the 1776 project, and I'm wondering how we historians can navigate this, because history does belong to everyone, and we want it to empower everyone and want people to be thoughtful, reflective, but also just to understand what happened. So
I've thought for a while that one of the things we need is a 1778 project, where, and I've thought about this as a next book, actually. So a year that shows us the revolutionary experiment as highly, highly vulnerable and contingent, which I think is something that we need to be reminded of all the time, right? There's nothing foreordained or permanent without our guardianship that comes of the best potential of what the Declaration tells us we can be. So a vulnerable moment, a really internationally enmeshed moment, right? That's the moment where at the beginning of that year, without the ability to make alliances and sustain them, for innocent and tactical reasons, the experiment could not have moved on to its next phase. A moment where, militarily, the American army had cause for tremendous humility.
Mm-hmm.
A kind of vulnerable revolution is back to what I said about Copley, shot through with contingencies, dependencies, entanglements that allow us to be both proud of our history, but also humble. I mean, I think one of the things that we're groping for between the 1619 project and the corrective work it wants to do with the way that the institution of enslavement is taught. I think something that teachers really are asking for. And then some of the rejoinders on what has called itself the 1776 side is a way to tell true stories that that can still activate us and not prostrate us as citizens. One thing that I'm always struggling with students and other young people in my life, including my own children, is thinking about ourselves in relationship to the past, right? We have not arrived at a stage of enormous human perfection from which we can sit in easy judgment of everybody who came before us and can't talk back, right? Like good history requires humility about other people's complexity and other people's struggle, and indeed about our own, right? What somebody will say about our own vex time in 200 or 250 years and the ways that we were imperfect. So I think 1619 project risks believing that we are at a state of moral perfection that allows us to make really clear and easy judgments. And 1776 project risks the opposite fallacy, right? That 1776's heroes were at a state of such moral perfection where we should just kneel before them. Citizens in a republic don't kneel, right? That is part of what it was all about, was that political leadership required engagement and not veneration. So too, I think the history of the period that we both care so much about.
That's great. I think that's a good place to conclude, though. If you have I do wonder what happened to the young man from Concord, whether he ever.
I should reach out to the young man from Concord, who was a lovely, lovely fellow. I will say this about the public history capstone version of the course that I designed in part as a rejoinder to his gesture. We continued to meet for over a year. We met through the pandemic virtually. We met as a book club over the summer, studying the Constitution together, for no credit or glory of any kind. Several of those students are still in my, sort of broad intellectual life. They correspond with each other when they see news about the founding of one kind or another pop up. So in terms of civic activation, I think from my small sample, there's a sign that it works.
Very good. Well, thank you, Jane. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for the work you are doing. It's been great.
Really good to see you, Bob. I look forward to the time we can meet in person again.
So do I. Take care. Thank you.
Cheers. Bye.